Well, hello, everyone. We'll get started right on time and people can continue joining as we go. So welcome to Getting to the Next Level, publishing in high impact journals. It is a professional development webinar presented by the AcademyHealth Health Econ Interest Group. If you don't know about the Health Econ Interest Group, we are the friendliest bunch of economists that I know of. And we're always looking for members and for people who are interested in joining the Advisory Council for Leadership. So watch the Academy Health website for more information about when to apply. My name is Molly Jeffrey. I am the Vice Chair of the Health Econ IG Advisory Committee and a Health Services Researcher and Health Economist at Mayo Clinic. Our goal today is for this conversation to be free-flowing and interactive. So please submit your questions in the Q&A, and you should be able to upvote questions that other people have submitted that you're interested in, so please do that as well. I am absolutely delighted to introduce our panelists today. Dr. Karen Joynt Maddox is a health services researcher and health policy researcher, a cardiologist, and associate editor for health policy at JAMA. Dr. Joynt Maddox is an associate professor of medicine at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis and assistant professor of social work at Washington University School of Social Work. She co-directs the Center for Health Economics and Policy at the Washington University Institute of Public Health. And relevant to this conversation, in addition to her editorial position, she publishes in clinical and policy journals, among others. Dr. Bapu Jena is the Ruth L. Newhouse Associate Professor of Healthcare Policy at Harvard Medical School. And I think it's actually Professor of Healthcare Policy. I'm sorry, Bapu, that's what I had. And a physician.
Not yet, Associate Professor.
Associate Professor, okay.
I was
right. Sorry, and a physician in the Department of Medicine at Mass General Hospital. Dr. Jena is also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he hosts the Freakonomics MD podcast, making him Dr. Freakonomics, and publishes in clinical policy and economics journals, including, as I noted, the coveted Christmas edition of the BMJ, which I don't know if you've done it more than once, but at least once with golf and clinicians. So let's get started. So the first question is just very basic. Why is it even important to get your papers into what I'm calling the next level journal? So you might start out like your dream journal, and then you want to target one that's even better, right? So why is that important? So we'll start with Karen, Dr. Joynt Maddox.
Sure. So thanks so much for having me as part of this great event. My first disclosure should be that I'm not a health economist, but I love health economists. So hopefully that makes me able to be part of this club.
See, we are a very welcoming group. That's what I said.
Like a health economist by proxy, meaning I try to work with as many as possible. I think actually the reason that I think it's so fun to sort of be part of JAMA or any other journal like this, I think the goal of all of what we do is to have impact. It's not to write a paper. It's not to do the analysis. It's ultimately to have impact. And the best way to do that is to get your work out. And luckily, a lot of these big journals have really impressive sort of machinery to try to get your work out more broadly. In addition to just lots of people read the journals, they tend to have podcasts and Twitter and lots of ways to get your work out to people. So it gets your work in the hands of the people that can ultimately help to drive the impact that you're hoping to have.
Bapu, anything to add?
I agree with everything that Karen said. I mean, there's professional reasons, obviously, to try and publish in better journals. Obviously, the better journals have larger reach. I would say, though, that, in the age of social media, you take two papers, one published now, one published 10 years ago. The impact of a paper 10 years ago in a lower impact journal, an impact of a paper today in a lower impact journal, in terms of just readership is going to be different because of social media. So I think it's probably now skewing more towards the professional benefits as opposed to the widespread reach of a place like JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine or Lancet, those sorts of places.
I mean, I think that's a great point. And we were just looking at altmetrics today. A colleague of mine and I were just looking at altmetrics and saw an altmetric for a JAMA article recently of like 11,000. So clearly it will help you get visibility, but as you say, even with like PubMed, right? So anybody can search, or Google Scholar, anybody can search for the topic and find it. You don't have to count on people seeing it in the journal. But with that being said, when we're applying for tenure, we get extra points for publishing in JAMA or New England Journal or other places. So so we're going to use this as kind of a framework for this next level journal. And you have both published in all three of these journals. So what is the difference between a paper that lands in JAMA versus JAMA Internal Medicine versus JAMA Network Open? And Karen, you are
go first. I was going to say
okay,
luck.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say luck. Well, go ahead, Karen. I'm curious.
Luck.
So do you mean what is the difference in terms of what characteristics of a paper might steer it toward one of those three places?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think for any of these, it's luck. Definitely don't underestimate that. The mood of the reviewers who it happens to go out to on that particular day. But I think it's a combination of the sort of inherent splashiness of a topic, which you have some control over, sort of what you choose to do. So say the concept has to be high impact in order to make it into the highest impact journals. And then the execution. So how well written is it and how well do you communicate your findings, I think makes a big difference also. And part of that is because the papers that are written, it's getting a little weedsy, but the papers that are written with the least amount of cognitive dissonance, right? So something that reviewers and editors can pick up and sort of read and get are going to be more likely to land in higher impact journals, even if they're about exactly the same topic. So part of it is the content, part of it is sort of the smoothness, I guess, of the delivery. And then, obviously some stuff that's out of people's control. Certain journals have certain bents, I guess. JAMA Internal Medicine is sort of known for publishing things that may be a little bit anti-establishment in terms of finding things that don't work, or they do a lot of stuff in pharmacoepi. Certain journals have different types of sort of personalities. And so sometimes where things get slotted also depends on what sort of the journal is looking for. Does it fit into our overall sort of goals for what we're publishing this year? At JAMA, frankly, they are thinking about how to balance clinical trials, basic science, genetics, maternal health, all of the things that are on the list. And health policy is only one of those things. So there's never going to be 6 health policy articles in an issue. That's just not the balance that they're looking for. JAMA Internal Medicine has a slightly narrower set of topics that they're trying to cover. So maybe a higher proportion might be health policy related, as they sort of reflect internal medicine. JAMA Network Open has much less of a preset construct for how many of each type of thing they're going to have. They more go for things that they think are going to be high impact and interesting. So across those 3 journals, there's also stuff that's out of your control about what the editors are trying to sort of, collate, I guess, for a year of a journal.
So how do we figure out what those are? Is there any way to figure out what those are, what the plans are for the journal for the year?
Not really, because there's not a plan like this year we want a paper on, a certain payment model or something like that. It's more that there's only a certain number of slots, if you will, that are going to sort of go towards health policy. So if we happen to get a bunch of interesting health policy stuff all together early in the year, there may be less appetite to pursue more on those same topics later in the year, right? Whereas JAMA Network Open is more likely to say, yeah, we'll publish 3 papers on bundled payments. That seems cool. These are all really interesting. You get sort of, if you're only going to have, say, 10 papers in a year that are going to be sort of original investigation policy stuff, you don't want 3 of those to be bundled payments necessarily. I say that as someone who does bundled payment work and has gotten the review back of like, this is interesting, but we're kind of bundled payments out right now. We need to be broader as we're thinking about health policy. We need things on other topics. So, it's just not in our list right now.
So is there a way to be strategic about which place to go to next then? Like if you do get that kind of response where it's like great paper, but we are out We're,
Not particularly. I mean, my own personal strategy is if I think a paper is going to be potentially high impact, give it a try at JAMA or NEJM. And then if they don't want it, they don't want it. But it's, you can't know, right? Like what sort of, I mean, I'm recused from anything that's too close to what I do, right? So I don't know what JAMA has sort of in the hopper that they may be ready to publish next week if it's related to what I do. You can't know that stuff. So in general, I try not to think about that when submitting papers initially, because you kind of never know who's going to really like it one day or another. If you think you have a good paper, give it a shot. And then as you sort of continue down the path, I think I generally at least pick journals based on where I want to publish and not really based on what I've seen done or trying to guess that, because you just can't see the next 3 months of publications till they come out, even if they've already accepted them. So it's kind of unknowable. And I don't know, to me, not worth worrying too much about. Do good work and put it out into the world, I think.
right. So just a quick clarification for someone who asked, JAMA Network Open is the open access journal. So those, the 3 journals that we mentioned, JAMA, JAMA IM, and JAMA Open, are all kind of general medicine journals that have kind of a broad scope. And JAMA Open is the newest of those and is an open access journal. So what exactly does that mean?
And then let me just say, Genevieve in the chat also mentioned JAMA Health Forum, which is a new JAMA subspecialty journal on health policy issues, which is a great place.
Yeah.
I mean, an open access journal just means that when people try to access your paper online, that it's ungated. So, it is available. Now, many funders are requiring now that you have open access for a paper. And that, that can present some difficulties in selecting a journal under certain granting requirements, more so in Europe than the US in terms of funders at this point. Means you have to pay. I've started writing publication fees into all of my grants and just saying this is increasingly a requirement. And so therefore, I'm not personally going to pay these fees, but try to write them into the grant so that it's not I don't have to decide where to publish based on that barrier. Because if funders want something to be open access, then they can pay for it to be open access. And most are happy to do that. JAMA Health Forum is also open access. So that's another place that if you have health policy or health services related stuff, it's as Babu said, I think it's a great option. It is also, you do have to pay. So it's worth just thinking ahead of time about where that funding can come from. I found institutions also pretty willing to cover that charge as well, especially for trainees.
And I will say, if I get a paper in JAMA, I'll pay out of pocket. Just like in the pharmacy, no problems, no questions asked.
Goes directly towards your tenure file.
Yeah.
And is there also a difference in the number of publications that they can the number of papers that they can take? So like JAMA Network Open is not a physical journal. JAMA is still a physical journal.
Yeah, so JAMA has a very specific number of pages and slots, essentially for each issue across a year. JAMA Network Open is not, and as you see, if you get the table of contents, it's quite a bit longer, and they can sort of flex much more on how they're sort of moving things through because of that lack of a print requirement. JAMA Health Forum is somewhere in between. They don't have the same sort of strictness, but they have more of an issue format than JAMA Network Open. They have a little bit more flexibility though.
So another interesting point on this, and to the point of the person who asked about like health affairs and adding, JAMA Health Forum. So the 3 journals that we talked about first are kind of these general medical journals. There's also lots of specialty journals that have really high impact factors, including higher impact factors than lots of general journals. So how do you decide whether to target a particular paper to a general journal versus a specialty?
So I would say I don't follow impact factor. I mean, so if you follow impact factor, you'd send a paper to a journal like Circulation over Health Affairs. Like, let's say there's a cardiology angle to your paper, you could send it to Circulation and it'd have a higher impact factor than Health Affairs. But if you're sitting in a general medicine, public health policy, health services research department, something like that, I think it's probably more impactful for your career to publish in a place like Health Affairs or health services research than it would be to publish in a place like Circulation, because the impact factor is just, I mean, it's derived by the types of people who read that article, and it may not generalize to health policy articles in a place like Circulation.
I feel like that gets to the point that you made first, Karen, which was, why do you want to get into a higher impact journal? It's to make an impact, to make an impact that actually changes practice or changes policy.
Yeah, and if I can get philosophical for a second, I've had my coffee. What you really want to do is not, what you really want to do in on your way to having impact is to be invited to tables, right? So who actually makes decisions and changes policy in the world? A paper doesn't do it. A paper teaches people things. A paper provides tools. A paper provides data. And then like people sit around a table someplace and make these decisions. And when I worked in the government for 2 years, I was like, it's going to sound very naive, but I was astonished to see there is literally a table, for example, for Medicare, where they go and they have all the things they're considering in folders, and someone hands, the HHS team a folder and they open it up and they either literally take it off the table or discuss it. And if you are at that table, you can have impact. And so part of what we're trying to do with papers is not only to build your CV for the purpose of CV building or to publish a paper for the purpose of advancing knowledge in that topic, but to also establish yourself as an expert in an area, so that when the people at that table are trying to make decisions, they give you a call. They say like, what do you actually think about bundle payments? Or what do you actually think about, whatever the sort of Medicaid expansion, whatever the issue du jour is. And so that's a long-term way to have impact. And to build to that, you need people to start seeing your name associated with a thing. You don't need to have a thing when you're a trainee, but by the time you're pretty established, it helps to have a thing. And so publishing in health affairs and health services research and medical care in JAMA Health Forum now also will get people to start seeing your name associated with a thing. And that's ultimately the being part of a community and being asked to be an expert is sort of the best way to have direct impact. So though papers don't do it itself, that's sort of part of the function of writing a paper.
Is where it ends up and who sees it.
Right. And who sees your name associated with it, so that when they're thinking about putting a panel together on the thing about which you have become an expert, you are included in the group of people that gets asked to comment.
How do you know that you are an expert on something?
Ooh, that's a meta sort of question.
It is a meta question, but so is it that BMJ and JAMA and NEJM think that your work is worth publishing? Is it that yeah.
But let me just say, so the economics answer is you look at what the market's willing to pay for your services in some capacity. Right? That's like but like I wouldn't tie my sense of expertise or worth or accomplishment to whether or not we can get papers into places like JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, BMJ, JMIM, all these sorts of places, for a few reasons. One is it's a crapshoot. It's incredibly difficult. When you had this sort of categorization of, how do you know whether a paper is going to get into JAMA, JMIM, or JAMA Oncology? I bet that if I showed you and others, and I've done this before, 20 papers in those journals, that we wouldn't do a very good job of saying that this was in JAMA, this was in JAMA IM, this was in JAMA Network Open. Now, if it's like a huge clinical trial on an mRNA vaccine, yeah, that's going to be in JAMA. But if it's, to Karen's point, if it's an evaluation of a bundled payment program, it could be in JAMA, it could be in JAMA IM, it could be in JAMA Network, or it could be JAMA, and we wouldn't know. You might get an inclination from the authors on the paper based on where they might try to send papers and what projects are sort of marginal for them. But I think it's really hard to know. And I'll say, and I'm sure Karen will say the same thing, is that most of the papers that I submit to journals have a really hard time. And it's not kind of easy to get them published. And I remember Ashish years ago, I used to talk to Ashish about publishing in journals. To say, Ashish, you published a lot of papers in New England Journal of JAMA. It's like, well, Bobby, you don't see the papers that I don't publish in those places. And that's true for us. That's true for me too. I suspect it's also true for Karen.
Yep.
Unfortunately, I wish it were different, but.
Well, I mean, I think the bigger point is that the goal of a professional career is to build a body of work and a body of expertise and a way to have impact. And the collective directionality of that is more important than any one item. So I don't know, it does feel like a little bit of a crapshoot. Which of my papers have gotten into high impact journals? Some will, some won't, but they're all sort of headed in the same direction. And so collectively, that's what you're building towards. If you want to increase your chances of having more papers published in higher impact places, you can't then assume that that's going to happen for every paper. It's just like your probability goes up a little bit, but it's not that everything is ever going to get into high impact journals or even medium impact journals for that matter.
But they're all your babies, and you all want all of them to succeed and do their absolute best. That's all.
It's true. I mean, how do you balance like where you send it first versus, like if you've got something that's timely and you don't want it to sit on the editor's desk, how do you balance how high to reach with the first place you go?
I'd say I have a reasonable gut feeling about what has any shot at NEJM or JAMA. And I sort of alternate those based on what I have where and that sort of thing. And then just sort of keep moving. But I anticipate for every paper, it's going to take 3 or 4 submissions to get in. I mean, and the paper gets better with every submission, right? So the nice thing about the process is that you get the first set of reviews back. And I feel this way for grants too. You read it once, you like swear at whoever the reviewers were and you leave it alone. And then come back to it a week later and people make really, really good points. And so the paper that you submit the next time is a better version of the paper that you submitted the first time and sort of, on down the line. And so the whole process sort of gets you to where you're going. But I never anticipate that it's going to be one and done for submitting a paper someplace. And my papers wouldn't be as good if that were the case, right? They really do get better as you get a little bit more external input into them. So occasional reviewer 3s aside.
It's always reviewer 1 for me for some reason.
Can I make one quick point, Molly, which is there's an endogeneity to this, which is worth talking about, meaning that we choose the research topics, people choose the research topics that they work on. And for sure, you should work on things that you are passionate about and you find interesting. So let me just start with that in mind. I will also say that in addition to that, I really personally only try to work on papers and ideas where I think I can credibly send it to a place like JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine. That's what I try to kind of do, and the standard I try to hold myself up to in terms of ideas that I might have or colleagues that might have that are willing to work with me on them. So I always kind of keep that in mind because a quote unquote good paper takes almost the same amount of time to write as a quote unquote bad paper. And I think we spend in career-wise, I'd say many people that I know spend a lot of time working on projects that are not as interesting, as important as the project that they might otherwise come up with, but just their preference, they happen to work on those topics or those particular ideas, even though if they spend time in a different way, they'd come up with a different topic. But it's really about preferences at that point. So I would say for people on the call, hold yourself, first do what you enjoy doing, but also think to yourself, can I send this to a place like JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine? And if you can't, at least pause for a moment and say, is this the project that I should work on? It may be, but if you're not asking yourself that question, you might be leaving a little bit on the table.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think one of the reasons that people do projects that may end up lower impact is because they find something and just go work on it. And I think the discipline of coming up with 10 ideas for every one that you really pursue is super important. And I remember Arnie Epstein used to do this with me, and he'd make me just write a list. And then I'd come into his office with a list and be like, okay, so here's one idea. It's, what about critical access hospital? He'd be like, okay. And then the next one, and I'd say, what about this? And he'd be like, okay. So I do the next one. And, out of 10, maybe a couple, he'd be like, maybe. And then I'd go and I'd take those couple and turn them into a 1-pager and then come back with those. And then eventually we'd end up with something where he'd say, yes, this could be a high impact paper. New York Times might want to pick this up, right? And all of your papers are not going to be that splashy, but you shouldn't just stop at your first idea. you should have the discipline to try to come up with high impact things. And usually it's taking what you're doing and maybe even just casting it a little differently or taking one additional step. That's worth it in the sort of intellectual pursuit of impact, right? To before you start doing all the work, say, what is the best idea that I have right now that I can put time and effort into? And for me, that requires external people to help me sort that out, because I think everything's super interesting. But getting a critic who will be like, yeah, that's not worth your time, is really, really helpful.
I feel like there's some really important nuggets in there about like looking for the right kinds of mentorship and not just depending on yourself and your own like ideas about what's important. I'm going to push back on one thing though. So is NEJM going to publish? So we know that there are topics that are just not being picked up, right? So health disparities is a huge one where we just know that historically it has been very hard to get those papers into the high impact journals. I see colleagues doing really outstanding and interesting work on the effect of like policing on health and public health, and they end up in like low tier specialty journals despite being very high quality work. So can you just comment on that piece, that there are some things that are just not of interest at the moment? So comment on that, and then is there a way to bring those things forward so that they are of more interest?
Yeah, one issue is that needs to change, right? And so I know that's not a very helpful thing to say, but it does feel like we're in the process of re-examining a little bit about what limitations we have. Global health is another example. I think disparities, global health, there's others, just whole areas where some of the big journals haven't had in-house expertise, haven't felt comfortable going there, haven't decided to invest in it. And I think some of those conversations are happening. And so hopefully we will see some change in that. But I mean, two thoughts about that. One is it doesn't need to be NEJM and JAMA per se. It needs to be whatever you think is the place you want to go. And if that's health affairs, if that's the American Journal of Public Health, if that's something really popular in economics, whatever it is that gets into the hands of the people who are going to use your work to do something with it, that's your sort of North Star. There's nothing super spectacular about NEJM or JAMA, except for that they happen to have a lot of readership, but they shouldn't set the priority for all things worth doing. So I totally agree on that, and don't mean to imply tailoring what you do to the exclusion of stuff that's really important and they aren't yet there on what they think is important. That's how innovation happens, right? So you certainly don't want to only aim for that, but you need to aim big at whatever that is for you. The other area of research that's really tough for this is qualitative work and other stuff that just doesn't get published in big journals. And same thing for that. That's there's some foundational, super important work in that space. And you just have to find then what is my version of that? Where is the place that I go with this type of work that's going to have its biggest impact? It's more the philosophical journey of what is my thing? What are my goals? How am I moving this field forward? And then what is the best landing place for this work, as opposed to NEJM and JAMA per se. I think the principle applies. But yeah, qualitative work and then global health and disparities are things that come to mind just immediately as being problematic for how they are handled by and sort of available in those journals.
There's another thing, Molly, that just a couple like kind of nuts and bolts type things. Sometimes I'll see papers which are really interesting, and they're a little bit kind of not in the mainstream for the types of articles that medical journals will publish. And I think that, the tangible ways that you might increase your likelihood of getting those sorts of papers into one of these journals, I think one is, trying to make sure that the paper is written and motivated in as clear and important a way as possible. And it really mimics what you see in other journals. So for example, one piece of advice that I give to anybody, and I do it myself when I'm writing papers, is I literally take a paper that I think is the model, and I don't copy it, but I follow it pretty closely. And so, for example, for many years, there's a paper actually by Karen on PCI in Massachusetts, and it used, I think maybe used Medicare data, and it was like a public reporting paper. And so the first time I was using Medicare data in a medical journal, I was like, I need to be able to write this in a way that is clear, where reviewers are reading it, they're understanding what they've seen, that sort of language before. And so I used a model, and her paper is a model that I would use. And I don't read, it's not like creative writing. You write the introduction, it should be the exact same number of paragraphs, plus or minus one or two every time. Follow the passive voice that you often see in journals. Like literally take a roadmap from a paper that is done well and try to replicate it and just layer on what you have done. The other thing that is sometimes helpful, and people differ on how, whether they're willing to use their sort of connections to facilitate that, is if you have not published, let's say in a journal like British Medical Journal, something like that, but you've got a really interesting idea, and I happen to see it, I'll sometimes say, I'd like to send it to the BMJ because I like the BMJ. They publish sort of interesting work, and I'm happy to broker an introduction between someone I might know and the author, because it helps everybody. Like, I want to see this paper do better because it's really interesting and I like that kind of work. Journals would love to get that sort of those sorts of papers, because they can choose not to publish it. So no one's forcing them to do it, and the author benefits. So I wouldn't be afraid to reach out to people who have published in journals, and most of the time they're going to say no, and probably most of the time I will say no. But if it's a paper that I really like and I'm excited about, I will send an email on behalf of someone and try to introduce them. May not work, but maybe it increases your likelihood by 5%. And some people might be willing to do that for the right paper. So that's something else to keep in mind.
You can also reach out to editors. I mean, I get people reaching out to me not infrequently with this kind of question. Like, this isn't exactly what JAMA usually does, and if it's something where I can give some quick feedback and say, we have rules, right? Like, data older than 5 years can't be published unless there's some great exception to that rule. So there's times I can look at something and just be like, this is a great paper, but, data are too old. Response rate is too low on the survey. It's just not going to happen. And other times I can say, this is really interesting. The introduction is pretty, written for a real specialty audience. If you could generalize this up and then send it in, we'd love to take a look, or, something like that. So you can do those sort of like pre-inquiries, or try to steer your work in that way. And I will 100% second the writing off a template. I literally have a template, and it says, like, first paragraph, what is the problem? Second, and I give it to every mentee that I work with. I'm like, don't reinvent the wheel. Write on the template. You can change it later. Start by writing on the template. And it makes the work that you have to do like 84 times less, right? Just fill in what the paragraph is supposed to be, and then go back and put in the bells and whistles and make it pretty. But I'm 1,000% a fan of a template.
That feels like really great advice. So can you be super explicit about exactly what you mean? So like, Bapu, when you say that you're willing to broker, are you talking about what Karen just said? So like, you literally say, hey, associate editor at JAMA, I just came across this paper. I think it's really interesting. Do you think you'd have any interest in it?
Yeah, that's exactly what. And again, it has to, for me, it has to be a special paper, because I have a very particular preference for the types of things that I work on. So if someone sends me a paper saying, what is the effect of accountable care organizations on XYZ outcome, that's not going to be in my sort of wheelhouse of interest. It could be incredibly important, but there are other people who know more about that and whose opinion about that, if they email an editor, would carry more weight. But if you send me like a Freakonomics type question, that's the type of stuff that I enjoy, and it's the type of stuff I'm probably better known for. So if I send an email on that type of topic, it may carry more weight. And I'll do it if the paper is good. But if it's a really good idea, but the paper is not good, and I couldn't see it in the journal, then I would just say, really good idea, really good methodology, and I believe the results, but it's not written in a way that's ready for prime time. And for me to send that email, it has to be like ready for prime time. But I'd be willing to do that, because again, I like this stuff. It benefits the journal to get that kind of paper that they otherwise wouldn't see, and it benefits the author. So everybody wins there.
That's great. And Karen, if I had a paper that I was curious about whether JAMA would be interested, how do I know to contact you versus one of the other AEs? Like, how do I decide who to contact?
So the AEs each have sort of an area they handle. So I handle all the health policy stuff unless I'm conflicted. And then there are people who handle, like, we have someone who does maternal health, someone who does surgery, nephrology, pulmonary, big sort of things like that. So if they're policy stuff, it usually comes to me. And if I am conflicted, I'll still give input. I just then can't handle the paper when it comes to the journal. I can only handle things on which I don't have an institutional or, personal co-author conflict. But you can still say in the little note, they have a little thing that says discussed with editor prior. Yep. And you can say, discuss with Dr. Joynt Maddox, who encouraged us to submit. Does that mean anything? I don't know. I mean, when I get one like that it has a different AE name on, so it says discussed with, Dr. Jacobson, who encouraged us to submit. It does make me think twice about whether or not to at least send it out for review if I'm kind of on the fence. Now, you don't want to do that if you have not actually discussed it with the person. It's not just like a sneaky way to get in there, because they will often send a consult within the system saying, hey, this has your name on it. Is this something you're excited about? What's the story here? But so that is an option that happens not infrequently.
How do I know who's the nephrology person? Is it listed on the mastheads in some way? They're
all listed. I actually have no idea if it's listed by topic. You would probably, if you're a nephrologist, you would probably recognize the person on there who's in nephrology. If you're not a nephrologist, I'm not exactly sure how you would. I don't know if it's actually listed. I'll look.
So you have to do some sleuthing to figure out each name, where they publish on in general on their own stuff.
Or like someone emailed me, a cardiology colleague of mine emailed me a couple of days ago and said, hey, we have this paper on maternal health. Who's the person at JAMA that handles that? And would you be willing to connect me for an inquiry? And so then I just looped in the person who does maternal health and connected them. So we all know each other. So even if you just know somebody at your institution or someone, that is in the vague general area, they'll know who to potentially get your paper in front of. You don't want to abuse that, right? Like you don't want to sort of send every single paper to get another set of eyes on it. That's not helpful. But when you do have things that you're particularly excited about, I don't see much downside to sort of, if you're trying to figure out where to submit it or, that sort of thing, I don't see much downside to reaching out.
So it's called an inquiry. So if you write to somebody, you'd sort of say inquiry on a.
Yeah, usually people say it's listed specifically as requiring a pre-submission inquiry for certain types of papers. It's not required for regular papers, but like for special communications or things like that, some of them say requires a pre-submission inquiry. So if you say this is a pre-submission inquiry, it will sort of trigger that, I don't know, that this is what this is about. That's the terminology people use.
Got it. So we have a bunch of people who are asking if you're willing to share your template.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll, let's see, how should we do this? I think we can actually just send it to the list of people who are, if you're willing to do that. So we'll figure something out. That's really generous of you. Thank you.
I have it somewhere on my computer. I send it to mentees all the time. I should probably look at it and make sure it's appropriately updated, but sure.
And Bapu, can you share your citation of Dr. Joynt Maddox's that you copy all the time?
Yeah. To be honest, many of the papers would probably be suffice for that regard. It just happens to be the one that I started with.
It's from a while ago. That was my K, actually.
That's a while ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So, question on when you're so we've kind of covered this a little bit, but if I've got a study that's mostly done, what's the number one thing I can do to get it from a mid-tier journal to a high-tier journal? And some suggestions that I've seen that seem to me to be a little odd is write a better cover letter. Like that face. Okay, so what is the role of the cover letter?
I don't know that you can change a manuscript's fate by the cover letter, other than if you wrote something completely outlandish. Your cover letter should look professional. It should be on letterhead. It should be short. It should say, enclosed, please find our paper on such and such submitted for your consideration. All authors meet requirements, whatever. Thank you for your time. No one really reads the cover letters at depth. It doesn't make I'm going to judge a paper on the paper. It literally doesn't matter what's in the cover letter. Other than that, don't introduce cognitive dissonance. Don't put crazy stuff in there about, why this relates to the death of your grandmother, or You must take this paper because it's the highest impact thing that's ever been written, both of which I have seen in cover letters, like just on letterhead, very professional. Here's our paper. Thank you for your consideration is about all you need. I really don't, others can disagree, but for me, a cover letter is not going to make a difference between accept and reject unless it's outlandish.
In which case it is reject.
Right.
That is amazing. I had absolutely no idea. I thought you were supposed to situate your paper and talk about what your contribution is.
That's what the introduction's for. So if you can't do that in the introduction, it doesn't matter. You can put whatever you want in the cover letter. But if I can't get that from the first 3 paragraphs of your paper, the reviewers won't either. It is not going to happen. I'm sold on a paper by the first 3 paragraphs. Right?
Wow.
So paragraph 1, what is the major problem you are trying that is out there in the world? So what you want, the emotional journey you want people to go on with a paper, right? Is they pick up the paper and they read the first paragraph and they go, oh my gosh, there is a huge problem out there that needs to be solved. Now you don't want to be, can't be too outlandish about that either, but same for grant writing. First thing you need to do is convince people that this matters. Next thing you need to do is reassure them that you're here to provide the answer that they need. And then you need to tell them that you're going to do it, basically. And by the end of an introduction, I know if the paper matters, at least according to the authors whom I trust. I can only do so much outside research in any paper, right? If I get 10 a week, I'm not doing a full lit review to decide on every paper. So you need to tell me as a reviewing editor, why is this important? What is the gap that's out there that needs to be filled? And are you going to fill it, or how you're going to fill it in sort of, very sketchy detail? And if I get to the end of the introduction and I'm like, wow, this is really cool. The rest, unless your methods are seriously mistaken, which is, sort of table stakes, right? Assuming good methodology, I want to know more. I'll send it out for review and then happen what may. But if you can't convince me in the first 3 paragraphs, this is worth reading, the readers aren't going to want to either, right? That is more important than the cover letter.
I'll just also mention that, good writing goes a long way, I think. I would say, the papers that are reviewed for the top medical journals, probably about 30% of them, maybe a little bit more, are not really well written. Now, it's correlated with the actual work. So it's not like I'm typically seeing really interesting ideas that happen to be poorly written, so that just writing it would have made the difference. But there are going to be some journals for which that is the marginal decision, where the question is interesting enough, but the writing was not was not good enough, didn't sell it well enough, didn't make it clear what was going on. So I think the writing is an underappreciated point. And I don't know if it's an issue of just how well people write, or if it's an issue of time spent, and you just have to prioritize writing and reading what other people have done and see how they've written it. It can be hard to originate good writing, but I think most people should at a minimum be able to look at what is good writing and then recognize it for what it is, and then figure out how to mimic that in their own writing, again, as opposed to trying to write, not trying to be a creative writer, but following a template in a different sense, more conceptual senses. This paper wrote this. It's very clear to me what they did. Let me see if I can replicate that sort of writing in what I'm doing. And that matters. A paper that's got a really good question that's written poorly is not going to play over well.
Yeah, because people don't have time to figure it out on their own. Reviewers are busy, editors are busy. So for me, talking it out really helps. So having to tell a colleague what my paper is about, if you're stumbling, you're like, well, so we wanted to look at this thing, and then there was this other policy that happened, and then you're not telling a good story, right? You should be able to go up to them and say, I'm trying to think of a recently published paper that's an easy one. I'll do the PCI paper, actually, and you should be able to say, there is concern that when we put public reporting into place, it will keep vulnerable patients from getting the treatment that they need. Massachusetts put this policy in place, and we are very concerned that it threatened access to care for people having heart attacks. Therefore, we aim to fill this gap by using Medicare data to understand the change in access to PCI after this policy was put in place. There's your introduction. It's about how long it needs to be, actually. And someone can decide on hearing that, do you think it's important enough to keep reading, or do you not? And if you can't tell a story like that in basically 5 lines, 5 sentences or so, then you probably need to keep going until you can. And that requires writing and rewriting and saying it out loud and rewriting. I don't know, well, certainly the majority of any section in the paper, writing the introduction is the most important part. Again, doing the research aside, the writing for the introduction is the most important part.
Do you start with the introduction?
I usually start with the introduction before I've written the paper, actually. So when I'm mocking up a paper in my head, it's introduction, tables, and figures. And once you're done with introduction and tables and figures, you're basically done with the paper. The rest is just filling in the pieces. You follow the template. You say, we got this data source. We did these analyses. The discussion is, here's a summary. Finding 1 means this. Finding 2 means this. Finding 3 means this. That's all. That's not the hard part, right? The hard part is good introduction and a logical order of tables and figures. That's 96% of a paper. And when I'm reading a paper, when I get a paper as an editor, I read the introduction and then I go to the tables and figures. And then I go back and look at the details, et cetera, et cetera. But if you sell me on what you're going to do, and then I can see what you did in the tables and figures, then we're off to a good start.
I feel like that is just like really rich advice. So, and you make it sound very easy, but that is a really hard thing. So you say, like, you talk it out. One of the things that I'm really interested in when I was reading your CV, Bapu, is when you list your mentees, you list like that they're, what journals their papers ended up in, and you've got some super high impact from your trainees. So how do you do that? Because I'm not going to guess that trainees, so I know that you get like your pick of like really fantastic people, but I bet they don't come in being great writers. So how do you do that?
Yeah, they typically don't, but if they're willing to work at it, I think they will become good writers. I don't think it's rocket science actually to learn how to mimic the work to mimic good work. I think that sort of the art comes into 2 things. One is the most important thing, which is coming up with an idea in the first place and figuring out what's worth working on versus what's not. And then the second one, which is much further below, but it's still something that has a component of art to it, is the framing. Like, Karen just told the story right here, and it's very, very clear exactly what was going on. So there has to be a framing that people can just automatically understand. And that's true even for really long econ papers as well. It has to be very clear why you're doing what you're doing, and then what you did, and why it might be important. And in terms of the writing, I just I give them a template of my own paper. Like, okay, so let's say we're doing a paper that involves an event study. I'll say, okay, here's my paper on marathons and mortality. Just literally try to copy it, except apply it to cardiologists going out of town. Just different questions.
I'm just about to bring up that paper.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love that paper.
Literally just like copy it. Don't be creative. And oftentimes what will happen is they'll come back to me with an introduction that's 2 pages. And I'll say, how long was the introduction here? It was a page. You didn't copy it. You thought you thought too much about this prompt. We got to think about how to figure out the questions and do the empirical work around it. That's where we really should be doing the thinking. But to Karen's point, the methods, they should almost write themselves, because if you have a template to follow, you don't require creativity. You literally just follow the template, and it will look professional, and it'll also be easier for you to do if you sort of adopt that view. But I think it's not native to most people to want to do that. They want to sit down and just write. And that does more harm than good, I think, in this type of work.
Or sit down and avoid writing. So I'm certain that there are many people out there who are junior, postdocs and grad students and junior faculty who feel like me, which is that the really fun part of the job is the discovery and like playing with the data and figuring out what's going on and having like the really rich insight. And then you start writing them up, and it's a typical, clinical study that has 12 co-authors, many of whom are very senior. And when they respond to and write comments, they just say, fix this and make it better. They don't like actually rewrite or anything like that. So what kind of advice do you have for people who are in that early stage, who really need to be transitioning to not just doing the fun part and doing the analysis, but also like really figuring out how to get their stuff, how to tell the story in a high impact way?
I mean, it's very helpful to have a mentor who sees red ink as a form of love, right? Like someone who really will put time into editing your introduction and say, we're not quite there yet. Or more importantly, put time into framing the study before you do it so that you know where you're going. But the translating findings into a paper need not be as hard as we make it, right? That's another reason for the template. I find opening a blank Word document to be like incredibly upsetting. I literally take an old paper and replace the paragraphs in it. And even though that's the same thing, it's so much easier that way. To find your own old paper that you like the structure of, open it up in Word. Actually, you can convert PDFs to Word these days. Take somebody else's paper and like literally just replace the paragraphs, right? If that helps you get going. It's the tricks to sort of getting things moving forward that sort of reduce the activation energy it takes to do it. And for me, that's just staying away from blank Word documents entirely.
Yeah.
I love that. What about you, Bapu?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working on a book, and it's I have no template, and it's very difficult. Like I'm thinking, like, oh, I don't even know how to start, how to transition. There's no guidance whatsoever for something that form of writing, where there is a lot of guidance here. There's a couple other things that I thought about over the last like 10 years or so and struggle with, which is, who to include on papers, how many people to include on papers.
Yeah.
Those things, I don't know that we have any good evidence on. Economics is obviously very different than medicine. Medicine frustrates me in a lot of ways because, you can have the same observational study, more or less the same, which two authors in the econ journal, but 12 authors in the medical journal.
Yeah.
And, clearly the 12 authors in the medical journal are not doing the same amount of work per person as the two in the econ journal. So I personally have always tried to minimize, to the extent that I can, the number of people who are involved, because it's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. It does perhaps sort of detract from your own contribution to the work, though I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it feels that way to me. But the one thing I do think about, and I don't know the answers, but I'd be curious to see what Karen thinks, is like, do you have to include authors who are not just going to make the paper better because they spend time and they know a little bit about the tricks of the trade, but whose name is going to be recognized when you send a paper to a journal? And I don't know the answer to that question. I struggle with that a lot, where early on I would probably include people who didn't do as much work as certainly as I did, but I'd made the decision to include them because I thought that their name would be recognized. But I didn't always do that. And I tried to stop doing that quickly. But it might be the case that there is some benefit to it. And I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah, I think on the, like everything, there's nuance to it, but certainly as a very junior person, submitting a paper by yourself just doesn't fly, right? In part because the people reviewing it are going to wonder, like, well, who else has had input in this? Do we know that people who have 10 years of experience doing this know that the methods are okay? So there is some need to include, people who can give you meaningful input, as well as people who just sort of give it a little bit of imprimatur of like, someone signed off on this. But you're right, the sort of more senior you get, the less that matters. To me, there's sort of a sweet spot of number of authors where everyone has contributed something. And maybe the most senior people have not done as much as some of the sort of workhorse folks on. You think about like analysts who are on papers, right, who do tons of work in terms of the hours put in. And then maybe you have a senior person who reads a couple drafts and makes a couple comments. It's clearly not equal. But there is some sort of middle ground where you've got, some established experts who are part of the project, but not 15 or 20 or 30 that really detract from, understanding what you contributed. With some data sets, you can't get around it. Like for some registries, you're sort of required to include people. I know of junior faculty who are required to include their department chair, which I think is kind of BS, especially if those people don't read the papers. So, there's a lot of, I think, messiness around this, but no senior people is not good as a junior person. You need mentors. And so you need to show that you have appropriate mentorship on papers.
Thank you.
There's one strategy that I did when I was a while ago, which is, there's a situation where if you have a lot of ideas, you can't do them all your own. The senior person may not have the time to help out, but there's another junior colleague who is similarly situated as you. What I would sometimes do is we would kind of split the work, split the writing, the data work, and we just alternate first and second author on papers. And it was a good model. And then we actually started alternating first and last author on various papers. And we were both sort of relatively junior, or almost kind of between junior to mid career. And we started just putting the senior authors somewhere in the middle. So that they still, to Karen's point, there was still some credibility component because you saw the name on the author list, but sort of the credit would be to the first and last author more so, and we'd split the work accordingly. So that's another sort of thing to keep in mind to improve your productivity: is find someone who is good, who you like working with, who's willing to kind of go back and forth.
Yeah, 100% agree, and it's a natural progression forward career-wise too, to move from. You do more work as a first author, and then you do a little less work as a second author, and then you do a very different kind of work as a senior author. And so as you move your career forward, it is helpful to have people that are at collaborators who are at different levels relative to you, to be able to give you different types of feedback, give you different types of help, and then to start shuffling the authorship. I've done exactly the same thing. Start moving into senior. The senior person will go into the middle. Eventually the senior person will remove themselves from things, even if they still are giving you support. There's a lot of sort of, I don't know, under the surface kind of politics that go into all these things. But if you have sort of good working relationships with the people on them, you can usually find a reasonably fair way to do it.
My sense is that at some point you become so senior that it's not even worth your time to fill out the ICMJE form. I'm not part of this. I'd rather just email you comments so I don't have to fill that form.
Okay.
So we have a question. I don't know if I'm ever going to get there. We have a question about listing order of authors. And one thing that I want to say for people who are not super used to this or haven't published a ton is, for me at Mayo Clinic, being the first author or the senior author is a specific important thing. And anywhere else in the middle doesn't matter in the same way.
Yep.
Can you guys comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So for going up for promotion from like instructor to assistant or assistant to associate, and then from associate to full, there's a different expectation for the proportion of your papers that are going to be first author versus senior author. Second author papers get you a little bit, and middle author papers get you nothing except volume. But if someone's actually looking for promotion, they're looking for first authors, and then somewhere between assistant and associate, they're looking for starting to have senior author papers, and then associate to full, you're basically done writing first author papers. So the question is now the group of mentees that you're growing, the programs that you're building, right? So it becomes a much different set of calculations. But early on, it's first author papers that really matter, with a little bit of something for second. It's not bad to have extra papers. I wouldn't turn down opportunities to be a middle author, but they do not count the same as first, for sure.
How do you do the co-first author thing? I've seen that before, and I have no idea how you do that.
I've never done that before. It's relatively uncommon, I think, but
I've seen it in papers where people say, there's an asterisk and it says these two people contributed. Okay, so you guys don't know.
I mean, you can do it. I think if you're the first person in the alphabet, you're always going to be listed as the first author in that situation. Okay. So it still looks different on paper, because in the actual print, like, is someone going to go in and see for promotion? Sure, I'm sure that counts for something. But in general, at least I try to be in situations where it's pretty clear who the first author is, and sort of avoid that anyhow.
So we have, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bob.
I was gonna say, the middle author decision, it depends on where you're in your career. Like early on in your career, there may be a benefit to having some volume. So it might be worth it to be middle author to do a little bit of work. Now, I almost never will enter into a middle author position unless there's something that really matters to me. Like if there's a question that's like right up my alley, I just love it, so kind of out there and wild, I'll be happy to be middle author, because I just like my name affiliated with that kind of work, because it's just it's right, kind of fits into my mold, and I like that. But in general, I try to not do much of that, because it's more effort, and there's if you're helping a mentee out, that's one thing. But
I was just going to say, the one time I always do it, if it's a mentee who's a first author,
Yeah.
or a close colleague who's a first author, and I can be sort of feel like I'm meaningfully helpful, I will join a middle paper anytime. There are plenty where I'm just like, wow, this is not worth the time and effort.
Yeah.
So we are at time. This has just been an amazing and fun conversation. And I feel like there were so many like nuggets of really great information for people. So thank you both so much for your time today. And thank you all for joining us. We have another upcoming webinar in May that is joint with the Trade-Offs podcast and how to get your work out there in front of journalists and policy folks. So hopefully you will join us for that. Watch for it on Twitter and elsewhere. So thank you both so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks.